Well, welcome to the Korea Economic Institute. We're very pleased to have the opportunity to partner with the Center for a New American Security, in particular to have Dr. Patrick Cronin here to talk about his new work that's just been released. You all have a copy of it there. A couple days ago, before it came off the press, I was working off of my paper version, so I'm gonna work with that because it's all marked up for me. But let me just tell you a couple things. One, I was thrilled as I was going through Patrick's bio, and I just want to share this with you. So I'm going to describe Patrick in his background as being Patrick Cronin, Ph.D., INS, IISS, CSIS, USAID, USIP, CNAS, CRS. And if you can parse all that out to the different organizations that he has worked with, with not just in passing, but solid few years in each, it will tell you exactly the breadth of experience that Dr. Cronin has. I envy him in a lot of these assignments. And so I know you're going to enjoy the scholarship and the discussion that's going to come out of today's activities here. And I can't think of a more timely subject, and I don't know if you can connect the dots here, but this particular project that he's been working on for a while, he's labeled Vital Venture, Economic Engagement of North Korea and the Kaesong Industrial Complex. We're at a particularly significant point in time in the Korean Peninsula. We've just had, as you're well aware of, a transition from an almost 70-year-old person in North Korea to a 12-year-old that, well, maybe not 12, maybe 28 in North Korea. And that's got to signify a significant doubt and potential change that will occur on the Korean Peninsula. We have upcoming the National Assembly elections in Korea in mid-April. We don't know how those are going to come out, but there's a potential for an impact on current Korean policy towards North Korea to change, to modify. We are then faced, as you well know, with presidential elections both in the United States on the 6th of November and then shortly thereafter in December for presidential elections in South Korea. And so, having the opportunity to take a look at this particular project and its implications, I think, is extraordinarily well worth your time and effort today. Patrick starts out part of his research by saying the ROK is losing what limited economic leverage it has over North Korea, and he talks about the increasing influence by China and a lack of communications channels with the North. And that struck me, that last one struck me particularly sensitive. I recall testifying a number of years ago before Jim Leach's subcommittee, and he was boring in on what are your channels of communications with the North Koreans. And I was very proudly telling him about the New York Channel and how frequently we talked, and his response was, "Is that all?" And so there's a corollary here, as Patrick will talk about, in terms of a very limited channel of communications between the South and the North, being really limited to what's going on in Kaesong. And then finally, without me giving the report, Dr. Cronin ends with some policy lessons learned both for South Korea and policy recommendations for the United States. So it's my pleasure to turn this over to Patrick. Thank you.
Jack, thank you. Thank you to the Korea Economic Institute. Thank you all for attending today. And it's just a great institution to talk about this subject. And so we're delighted at CNAS to be able to release this report here. But let me encourage you to visit the cnas.org website if you want to download this report. It's available on Kindle. And thank the Korea Foundation as well, which helped to underwrite my research all last year, and this was a real learning experience for me. There have been some great studies done specifically on the Kaesong Industrial Complex, one of them done by CRS analyst Mark Mannion, who's sitting here in the first row. And I didn't want to replicate that. I didn't give credit to all of the really dozens and dozens and dozens of officials, most of whom wanted to remain unnamed, who I interviewed in the process of this last year's project. This is not the last word on the subject. It's really meant to be my beginning launching point for thinking about the future of economic engagement in North Korea and trying to look at North Korea more in the round. I say that more in the round because from a Washington perspective, the focus is predominantly on the nuclear issue. And we often give much less attention, there are some notable exceptions, but we give far less attention overall to the economic and the political dimensions. And I think there really are some major trends afoot that will have an impact on U.S. and South Korean policy. I think it's very instructive to look at the rush, especially in the media, to judge this last week's agreement with North Korea. People want so badly to put a headline, a label on it, breakthrough, capitulation. It's neither one of those. And my report, I think, starts to help explain really why, even though this report was done essentially in December, that agreement was well in train several months ago and even through last year, as I'll talk about. But I think we need to broaden our aperture and look at these issues from an economic and political dimension, not just the nuclear talk dimension, as important as that is. So at the largest level, Vital Venture, this report, tries to show that the alliance attempt to gain leverage over a nuclear bargain these last 4 years has inadvertently neglected growing Chinese influence in North Korea. We can debate how much, who knows. It's left the United States in particular less than well prepared to engage North Korea in the midst of this historic transition. Even if there's no fundamental change in the leadership, we don't know. And it's also not set us up very well here in Washington for a potential policy shift, 90, 180 degrees, if elections in the National Assembly in April and for the Blue House in December go in a very different direction from the current politics. And so the Korean experience with the Kaesong Industrial Complex becomes for me a metaphor for which way will North-South relations go, which way will U.S. and Korean Peninsula relations head in the future. Will it be sort of a relic of an attempted but failed rapprochement, détente, and breakthrough, or will it be really the catalyst for and the model for a future engagement policy that could come about? So let me talk, hopefully briefly, about the Kaesong Industrial Complex evolution, talk briefly about China's economic inroads, and then end up with some policy implications, especially for the United States. And I'll try to do that relatively briefly so we can have engage in some good Q&A, and I can learn from the expertise in this audience. I apologize for some of the deep experts in this room. I do want to provide some basic background for those of you who may be less familiar with the Kaesong Industrial Complex, but there's obviously more material in my report, and through my footnotes, you'll find a lot of other resources that have a lot more depth on some of these issues as well. It's interesting to note that the origin of the Kaesong Industrial Complex really grew out of the end of the Cold War. It grew out of a private sector initiative. That's important for Washington to remember, where we always think government has to be responsible for leading policy. This was Hyundai Group founder Chung Ju-young catalyzing an initiative to reach out to Kim Jong-il and to eventually work through the thicket of Cold War-like politics to set up an industrial zone. It really got the catalyst from German unification. If you want to be prepared for sudden unification, you better prepare gradually ahead of time to reduce the economic inequality that exists, so you're not stuck with a whopping tax bill or conflict. And I think that largely drove some of the thinking on this. It certainly was picked up and made possible by the presidency of Kim Dae-jung, the opposition leader who came to power through the December 1997 election and adopted a sunshine policy which I don't need to recount here. It did have a three-phased approach to first engaging North Korea, kind of decoupling economics and security issues, providing humanitarian assistance. In fact, Kim Dae-jung provided what was a record level of humanitarian assistance that stood more than a decade as the record amount that South Korea provided the North, leading then to confederation or some kind of common market over another period of decade or more, and eventually finding a path toward unification. That was the theory behind this decoupling tactic of seeking peace. Of course, Diamond Mountain, Mount Kumgang tourism zone was set up to allow people-to-people exchange and kind of provide a vision for how the North-South relations could change from war to personal diplomacy and peace. As a practical matter, though, it provided money in the coffers of Pyongyang in exchange for South Korean tourists, almost predominantly, to visit a fairly remote tourist site essentially built by the South Koreans in North Korea. The speech by Kim Dae-jung in Berlin in 2000 was a milestone. That was, of course, the new capital again of united Germany. And there, Kim Dae-jung promised to essentially end the Cold War, in this last vestige of Cold War, to underwrite North Korea's economy through major infrastructure, major social and economic investment. That was a bold move. And it was essentially debated and discussed at a summit meeting, a historic first North-South summit meeting later that year with Kim Jong-il, where the industrial zone concept in particular was part of a package of ideas. The groundbreaking of the Kaesong Industrial Complex in 2003, and this is a 800-acre zone 6 miles north of the DMZ in a historic, just outside of historic Kaesong, which has great historic meaning in the Korean Peninsula, was by 2005 housing thousands of North Korean workers run by South Korean business managers and businesses and starting to produce light manufactured goods, everything from electronics to textiles. And it was a part of a very ambitious plan that would, by this year, 2012, this was going to be the year it was complete. And it was going to be 350,000, but some talked about even 500,000 North Koreans could be employed in this zone, in a region around the zone, which would be a major North-South economic interaction zone. You could have $20 billion of business going on there, they thought. It's only about 1/7 complete compared to those statistics, 1/7 to 1/10, depending on whose sort of projections of what their ambitions were at different times. So it really hasn't come to fruition. It certainly hasn't had the transformation effect that South Korea, either President No or President Kim Dae-jung had hoped. But it certainly has kept the attention of Lee Myung-bak because it has been kept open, as I'll talk about. The post-sunshine policy that was put in place by the current president of South Korea, President Lee Myung-bak, was an attempt to return to a search for reciprocity in North-South relations. That is, stop giving gifts to North Korea because they're continuing to pursue their nuclear program and their other programs, and start trying to figure out a way to get more leverage, including economic leverage. Unfortunately, that met with a fairly apparent North Korean reaction. Missile tests, a second nuclear test, and then lethal uses of force in 2010. The Chonan in March, the shelling of Yeonpyeong Island in November of 2010, and essentially a very frosty relationship that continues to this very day in Pyongyang, where there's still a great rallying cry about the mad dogs in South Korea coming from North Korea as they try to show a military-first policy, and Kim Jong-un tries to gain legitimacy and authority. Much better shouting epithets, though, than shelling South Koreans. So this was met, of course, with patience on the part of South Korea, but maybe too much patience. The May 24th sanctions that went in place in 2010 after the Chonan investigation showed fairly conclusively that this was a North Korean torpedo that sunk the South Korean naval corvette. essentially severed all economic ties, except Kaesong was kept open, interestingly, and the pipeline of projects, the small pipeline of projects that would hire more North Koreans was kept open as well by President Lee Myung-bak, even though there was pressure to close the whole thing on the part of many conservatives in the country. It has been trying to walk back toward engagement in 2011, which has been a very tricky road for the South Korean president because North Korea does not trust, apparently, the South Korean government, does not want the deal, essentially, or want to give in to the pressure of the South Korean government. That has made it very difficult to re-engage at a large level, even though South Korea has tried. Every one of South Korea's back-channel attempts at breakthroughs with North Korea in 2009, in 2010, in 2011. I can't go into all of the details, but I've had many discussions with senior officials, and they've told me in some detail just exactly how much of a breakthrough was about to happen. I was in the office of senior officials when they told me it was about to happen next week several times. And each time there was grave disappointment on the part of what North Korea did. Rather than making a deal to the hand that Lee Myung-bak was trying to extend, even through his Vision 3000 of a grand bargain, of kind of saying, we're going to be rough, but we really want this tough love to end up with a peace deal. North Korea did not relent, but stayed aloof. The thing is that we have now three important developments, right? We have the death of Kim Jong-il. And I was in the Unification Ministry the week before Kim Jong-il died. And there's some great people in the Unification Ministry throughout the Korean government. I mean, I'm a staunch supporter of the U.S.-RK alliance. Lee Myung-bak has been a great friend of the United States. But the Unification Ministry was telling me that Kim Jong-il was now there to stay for at least a couple more years. This was the week before he died. So you've got to be very careful about the assumptions you make. I want to be very careful about the assumptions I make. I think any of these trends right here are something that can be amended rapidly. I don't think this is a foregone conclusion, but I am trying to portray these economic and political trends and where they could be leading and why we need to be better prepared for this uncertain development, both politically and economically. And the first one is the fact that with Kim Jong-un, we have a mystery on our hands. It may be a mystery that you think you know. I may think I have ideas about Kim Jong-un and the collective leadership, but I don't know that. And I would challenge your sources on exactly why you think you know as much, or why even our top officials in Washington or Seoul think they know as much as they do. The reality is we've had precious little contact with the new collective dynamics of leadership that could be evolving day by day right now in terms of how they make decisions, who makes decisions, what kind of decisions, who's making the friendship, what kind of relationships are they building, where are they heading, why might they change direction? These are the critical questions I want to know, and I think ROK and U.S. need to know this year. Now is the time. The second trend is that the political winds in South Korea have been turning for some time. We saw this with the mayoral election in Seoul last fall, was essentially a referendum on Lee Myung-bak and the GNP. So you have potential, I think a likelihood really, that the conservatives will lose their legislative majority in the National Assembly next month. And in December, we don't know. It's a long way in politics. A day is a year. It's a long time. But in December, there's a very good possibility that there will be a different North Korean policy emerging out of the Blue House by February of 2013. And it could be significantly different. It could be 180 degrees different, in fact, in terms of not going back exactly to a sunshine policy. But some members of the Democratic United Party tell me that they really do want to now build that expressway that the North Koreans have asked for, all the way to Pyongyang, to build a second industrial zone in Nampo, the main port outside of Pyongyang. And this will give inter-Korean relations, finally, the land lines of communication and the sea lines of communication that lock in future confederation, if not unification, and be very much a counterweight to the heavy Chinese investment that could now really start to pour in. Again, big mystery there because it's hard to come up with transparency. It could start to pour into that warm water port in the Raison district that we heard here talked about a couple weeks ago by an excellent young researcher. Let me turn to China's inroads very briefly and just talk about, in the past 11 years, we've seen a tenfold increase in Chinese official two-way trade with North Korea. And it's escalated significantly in the last few years. In addition to that, there are these figures floating out that are hard to cooperate because there isn't transparency, but there does seem to be an obvious set of empirical proofs to show that, one, we hear from officials on the ground in Pyongyang, even just recently, what's the most dramatic change you've seen in Pyongyang in the last 3 years? Answer, Chinese presence. What happened when Kim Jong-il started to recover from a stroke after 2008? He started to lobby more heavily for Chinese and Russian investment. And as we heard again a couple weeks ago, the Chinese provincial governments were now wealthy enough and had enough cash that they really wanted, in a very ambitious regional provincial plan that included that warm water port and other access to the northeast in Raison, in the Chinese essentially run special economic zone. And obviously other Chinese investment after anthracite coal and after rare minerals also has been increasing as well. There's no doubt. And the official numbers don't include remittances, money under the table, and other things that we can go into, but are hard to prove. You could argue as well, I want to go back to 2010, this current deal. If we look at, if I'm right, that North Korea was essentially reacting to Lee Myung-bak's attempt for leverage by upping the ante each time with missile tests, nuclear tests, lethal use of force 1, lethal use of force 2, the United States administration, the Obama administration, according to one senior official, was extraordinarily disappointed by China's unwillingness to put pressure on North Korea until the end of 2010, when Dai Bingguo finally went to Pyongyang to read the Riot Act. But at that point, the South Korean government had already essentially created a new red line of deterrence by putting the military forces of the Republic of Korea on essentially a hair-trigger alert, so much so that it created new questions about the U.S.-ROK alliance. Were we ready to work closely with the South Koreans, our close allies, on this issue? And it created a momentary concern about, we're not that far away from a northern limit line being an escalation into who knows what, because that does introduce the possibility of a wider war, with including China, if that were to happen. A lot of uncertainty, at least. And, but I think both the South Korean pressure and the Chinese pressure finally, however belated, told North Korea that by 2011, they needed to start to find some more diplomatic space. And so we had this quiet back-channel talks toward, which is why they thought there was going to be a breakthrough last spring in 2011. That didn't happen. Finally, when Lee Myung-bak got a new Minister of Unification in the fall, working with the United States and with China, in October last year in Geneva, the outline of the current deal that was announced was outlined and essentially agreed to. I was in the Unification Ministry the week before that deal was supposed to be signed, sealed, and delivered in Beijing last December. Okay, so the interesting thing that's just happened last month and last week is that Kim Jong-un, signaling the desirability of continuity, has picked up that deal. That's a good thing, as long as we understand what it is. It's a deal that satisfies the interests of the countries involved. For North Korea, wait, I can't go back because China doesn't want me to go back to keep ratcheting up. And now I can bide my time for a new government to come about. I don't want to use lethal force for the rest of 2012 because that will only encourage a much more hardline regime potentially in the Blue House in 2013. So, and I need assistance, and by the way, I need to consolidate my own authority. Who knows what that discussion is? All those reasons and others, perhaps, North Korea, this is a good moratorium at the moment, however limited, however imperfect. For China, they are the responsible stakeholder. They've done what we've asked them to do, in a sense. They can take credit for getting back. North Korea vowed they'd never go back to the six-party talks. They still haven't yet. But the point is, they seem to be willing to head back in a direction of diplomacy, and China will take credit for keeping that. And meanwhile, they have what they desperately want, which is stability, stability, and more stability on their border. For the United States, heading to a nuclear summit next month, it's a political, tactical political victory. It's a keep the transitional regime from being more likely to revert to lethal force, because any prediction about North Korean behavior always has an asterisk, to be determined by Pyongyang leaders. Could be entirely different from what we predict. So, the fact is that U.S. thinks it's going to be more likely to keep Kim Jong-un collective leadership contained, relatively contained, and we can talk about what that might mean, in 2012 by talking to them and getting back to a deal. And for South Korea, although they got stiff-armed by, and still are being stiff-armed by North Korea, at least publicly, it can honestly take credit for saying that their firm deterrence after the two lethal uses of force in 2010 seemed to almost surely had an effect on North Korea to say, we're going to have to play it a little more peacefully in the next year or two while we think ahead. Finally, on U.S. policy, we've seen an unprecedented alliance between the U.S. and South Korea these last 4 years, and it's been a great experience because a lot of officials on both Seoul and in Washington, I think, over the years, have a lot of jokes to tell offline about how difficult sometimes the diplomacy can be in the alliance, even though it's a very close alliance. We've often gone in opposite directions politically, even when we've basically been agreeing on the machinery of the alliance and on the fundamental purpose of the alliance. But really, for the last 4 years, it's been fundamentally aligned in many ways, not just the Korea-U.S. Free Trade Agreement, not just the UPCON reversion being put off to 2015, the handling of North Korean policy, and being steadfast in support of really making a deal, a de facto deal, whether it was made or not, who knows. But in effect, the United States has said, South Korea, you are in the lead, and South Korea said, the United States will pursue your nuclear policy as our nuclear policy. In effect, that's how tight the alignment has been. But it's left us now, as I say, at the end of 2011, it left the U.S. and the ROK with very few channels of communication. Yes, there's the missing in action still, that small dialogue, and that should be continued, but very, very few. And I don't want to exaggerate how adequate these channels of communication are. I'm not saying that communication automatically gets you access to Kim Jong-un or the collective leaders. We're still negotiating with Kim Dae-gwan, the same guys we've been negotiating with all along, but we have to be trying to get military dialogue. We have to be trying to get a wider political dialogue. We have to get humanitarian assistance on the ground. We can talk and should talk about that decision. I know my former boss, Andrew Natsos, has written about the need to keep a firewall between humanitarian assistance and security negotiations, and we can certainly talk about that going forward as John Browse and Ambassador King have been negotiating the details of the delivery of assistance that will happen. We need essentially to keep our eyes and ears open right now while we turn inward in policy, both in the United States and then in the terms of the alliance, and do essentially what Secretary Bill Perry did, former secretary at that point, at the end of the Clinton administration when he did a bottom-up review of U.S. policy options on Korea, because the trends that I'm talking about in terms of Chinese investment, in terms of potential South Korean policy changes that could be coming, and just the very fact that we are dealing with the third generation of Kims in North Korea. All of those reasons suggest that we need to think about nuclear policy in light of these economic trends, in light of these political trends, and we even need to throw back into those discussions what about the plan right now for December 2015 return of wartime operational control? Is that still the right thing to do? And if so, are we ready? And what else do we need to do in light of this potentially new diplomacy? What about establishing some kind of military-to-military contacts with North Korea? How do we do that? So the Korean experience at Kaesong Industrial Complex may yet become a model, or it could become, again, a relic, a vestige of this place where North Koreans, especially North Korean women, came in and were given boxes of choco pies and allowed to take as many showers as they wanted and have access to tea and coffee, things that immediately opened their eyes to the fact that there is a better life out there. And they started to ignore their political minders from North Korea. I mean, there really was a glimmer of hope for the South Koreans watching this actually transpire on a daily basis, day after day after day after day. The same thing would happen when new North Korean workers would come in to Kaesong and be open to this. So I want to just stop there with the idea that South Korea, a $1 trillion economy, staring down North Korea, a $27 billion economy, now some very large percentage of which is being underwritten by China. China's overtaken South Korea as the main economic benefactor in a big way. It seems to me, when I think about another country altogether different, Myanmar, Burma, and what President Thein Sein is doing right now to try to lead a reform movement, to open up, to rebalance his economy away from just China to India, ASEAN, others. Maybe North Korea also sees a strategic benefit, or will come to see, if they don't see it yet, a strategic benefit in having a diversified economy. And maybe they're willing to do things for that diversified economy eventually. Not now. Denuclearization is not going to happen anytime soon. So the only question is, what do we do in the meantime? And so I'm going to stop there. Don't let down your guard is my last word of caution. Even while I'm big on engagement, never, ever, ever let down your guard. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Patrick. There's, if you didn't take the notes that I did, let me just reiterate that the best takeaway here is historians are going to be looking back in the future to the demise of North Korea. They're going to give credit to the South Koreans for Choco-pie diplomacy.
Absolutely.
Patrick, let me, if I may, get the first question in before we open up to the audience. And then I would just ask you to raise your hand. We've got some folks around that will bring a microphone to you. Please state your name, and if you have an affiliation, then ask your question or provide a comment for our discussion. In your paper, and you alluded to it in your comments, you kind of end with a cautionary note about a potential crisis in the alliance. And I'm, if you could just give us a little bit more about what you're thinking about and what that portends.
Yes, thank you, Jack. And I don't want to exaggerate a crisis in the alliance. I don't think there is any alliance that doesn't have periodic crises. And of course, we can go back to the grand experience of the transatlantic alliance and all of the times we were, had to write off the gap in transatlantic understanding has periodically gone through major crises, and yet it's endured and remained important. And I think the same thing, even when the Blue House and the White House have been at loggerheads over specific policies, the actual fundamental alliance, the military readiness to defend, deter, defeat, if necessary, aggression on the peninsula has never really been in question. So I don't want to exaggerate that. But it's certainly in contrast to the kind of tight alignment we've had most recently and even now, we could start to see a much wider divergence between Seoul and Washington when it comes to North Korean diplomacy, even China diplomacy, and this could lead to other issues. Again, opposition could even want to renegotiate chorus, as they've talked about, and the trading arrangements. These have long-term implications for the future of U.S.-South Korean relations and U.S. relations with the Korean Peninsula at all. I think in particular, the idea that the United States has been able to count on South Korea to agree to Washington-based goals of denuclearization, I think that assumption in particular is the one that has to be questioned. I don't think we can do that next year. And so if we can't do that, how do we avoid what happened to George W. Bush, when he had to, Kim Dae-jung rushed to the White House after George W. Bush became president and said, I'm delighted to be here. I want to tell you all about my sunshine policy, and was met with, are you kidding? And the point is, it took 4 years to sort of get that alliance back into a shape. And even then, there was a lot of difficulty, let's say, diplomatically, between officials at time to time. I don't want to go back to that. I want to make sure that the U.S. South Koreans are fundamentally using the alliance for the same purpose, even if they do have different tactics for wanting to achieve that. But the denuclearization question, again, we've reduced Korea, this very complex place, to a very simple technology at the end of the day. It's not so simple, but to a single technology. And we can't do that. Korea is a political, economic, social, cultural, and yes, technological corner of the world. we have to see it in the round. And so Washington, and there's smart people in the administration, and I'm not giving them credit here, but I'm saying the way it's being perceived on the outside and the way it gets treated in the press, it gets reduced so simply to this single issue. We have to get over that. And of course, during an election year, good luck trying to do that. Yeah, exactly. Because, engagement with North Korea is not, the only thing going for engagement with North Korea right now is that it allows us to focus on Iran. That may be the only good thing at the moment that you could argue in an election year. But we have to be ready for a fundamental shift in South Korean policy, I think, in 2013. And meantime, we just should be engaging this transition. There are times in history when you have an opportunity to test and probe and see whether you can build a different relationship. I would argue this is one of those times. And it doesn't mean that I think that there's a single reformer that you can identify in North Korea. There may not be today a single obvious reformist. There are some probably. There's certainly the technocrats. But the point is, we should be trying to see whether we can create them. Again, let's consider Burma, Myanmar. How did generals start to think about this? Well, let's think about South Korea. Where did generals start to think about economic growth? It is possible. It's going to take time. And meanwhile, we have these real dangers of nuclear issues. So I don't want to trivialize those dangers either. But since North Korea is not likely to give them up willingly anytime soon, we have two choices. We can either work for the collapse of North Korea, and some people would like to do that. And I think that's extraordinarily dangerous because you can't tell, my children how that comes out. On the other hand, I would like to have more control over the glide path of the future of the Korean Peninsula, working with our South Korean ally, rather than having to work at odds with our ally and not having control over that future.
Okay, great. Thank you, Patrick. All right, for those, let's open up the conversation. Jeff. There it is.
Thank you. Keith Krulak, I'm an economist at the State Department, and I look forward to reading the work. My question is sort of more political economy, and something I don't understand, focusing more on economics. You mentioned this idea of influence or leverage. Can you be a little bit more explicit what you mean by China, through its potential investments, getting influence or leverage over North Korea, whereas South Korea seems to be losing it? When you're talking about a sovereign nation which in the past has always worried about leverage and influence, however you want to define it, by even its closest benefactors, the Soviet Union, Mao's China, and ultimately, what does that investment give these outside forces, as opposed to what does it give Pyongyang? Thank you.
And Keith, those are good questions. Those are exactly the things that our government should be delving into and looking for more information. I can cite a number of interviews I've done, including South Koreans who have interviewed extensively North Korean defectors and found them unanimously, anyone tied to the party or the military in North Korea who defected, saw his or her benefit in life, prosperity, if you will, North Korean style, came from China. That's one data point. Another data point is simply from the diplomatic community in Pyongyang, saying North Koreans seem to be impressed with the growing Chinese influence there, and it seems to be actually counterintuitively well received, as opposed to the historic complete xenophobia that North Korea seems to be famous for, and that we certainly attribute to North Korea. I think there is a suspicion about the Chinese. I mean, there has to be, strategically. And it's the same thing in, again, a very different country, but when you look at some generals in Naypyidaw, in Myanmar, there's a lot of suspicion about China, even while the Chinese cash from those dam and hydroelectric projects, it's flowing right into the generals' pockets. And that's what's happening in North Korea, one suspects, with Raison. It's not going to the North Koreans in northeast North Korea. It's going right into the generals and parties' leaders' pockets. And they're getting very rich, presumably. And that leads to corruption. Anybody who works in development and development economics, you have a kleptocracy. So we have, whether it's Andrei Lankoff's, say, prognostication of, or estimate of 1,000 key people who are really, deeply invested in this, or whether it's up to 3 million people in the population who are indirectly or directly benefiting from this kind of economic investment. And it's not cash, some of it is, but a lot of it's just in kind. Infrastructure, technology, knowledge, vendors and trucks coming in across the border, who knows what they're unloading. Those things are starting to make the difference between survival and a potential loss of survival on the part of that regime. So it's having influence. How much? How does it translate? We know from Soviet economic aid in the Cold War what a flop that was. But it's different in the case of China and North Korea, where they're building up along the borders. And in the Northeast, there seems to be genuine Chinese enthusiasm for that investment project, as opposed to on the Yalu, where there's been ambivalence. And we can go back to the 2002 failed special economic zone attempt, where Kim Jong-il, this was in the middle of, and Jack was probably there, so he probably knows this, but even just from the public record, this is from a time when Assistant Secretary of State Jim Kelly was challenging North Korea on its uranium enrichment program, not just the plutonium program. And the Kaesong Industrial Complex negotiations were stalled. They were stalled over details and legal issues and other issues. And suddenly, Kim Jong-il says, I've got a great idea. A major entrepreneurial zone, on the Yalu, near Dandong, just on the North Korean side, will now be created. And I'm going to give the Orchid King of China, second richest man in China reportedly, the run of the show. And that was a lie for a few months, and then the Chinese arrested him, and he's still in jail, as far as I know. And they shut that down. And then, lo and behold, the next year they had the groundbreaking for the Kaesong Industrial Complex. So North Korea was clearly looking for economic investment. I think there's reason to believe that North Korea wants a diversified economy, but of course, North Korea always wants something for nothing, essentially. At least nothing when it comes to our core interests, and that's been the problem. And I'm not recommending that we give them something for nothing. But I'm saying we better rethink this policy in light of these trends, because tenfold increase in Chinese investment is starting to look like a pretty big part of the North Korean economy. Meanwhile, the Russian interest is there too, but they're not throwing the kind of money, even with a pipeline thrown in, it still doesn't come close to the kind of money Chinese are throwing in. Only South Korea can really provide that kind of investment. And only something like Kaesong that actually will start to pave the way toward a confederation of economic union or something in the long term. It may be a very long term. This could take decades. But that eventually seems to me, the infrastructure will tell the story of the future of the Korean Peninsula.
Okay, great. You're right here in the middle.
Department of Treasury. I'm an economist there. Hey, Keith. I think one needs to consider kind of the two stories you just told, and the first is the corruption of cash on the leverage that is being gained from the Chinese investment. When you look at the Chinese investment in North Korea, I think the Chinese have kind of learned their lesson from the past, and it's not a lot of cash. It's a lot of capital investment. Not to say that there's not cash, there's probably tons of it, but not as much as there was in the past. So the leverage is actually kind of smart leverage in the fact that it's building roads and bridges and complexes. Whereas if you look at the Kaesong Industrial Complex, it's almost the reverse, and it reduces, I think, South Korea's leverage, because the payment mechanism there is the South Korean government pays directly the wages of these North Korean laborers in US dollars to the North Korean government, which just lines the regime's pockets, and who knows how they're using that money. I mean, they can fund whatever programs they want with, if you look at just 56 or 50,000 North Korean employees at $73 a month or whatever they earn, you're looking at probably $60 million just pure cash. What, US dollars, absolutely. Right. What should be done, at least, or what I think should be done, is why don't they pay? I mean, it's stipulated that they should pay the North Korean employees directly. But if you really want to build that economic partnership, pay them in South Korean won, which would force inter-Korean trade and not let the money flow. And even better, instead of paying it in cash to the government, keep it at a central bank account in South Korea. That way you force it to be used directly for trade-related items. I think that is kind of a carrot-stick hybrid that is kind of on the Chinese model here, where it's smart leverage and not just give them something for nothing.
Sure. Let me just respond to that. Excellent point. Excellent sort of, and I agree with everything you said, but let me just add to a couple of different points. The Chinese level of influence is unknown. I mean, again, with my visits to Korean officials, they have a lot of PhDs working on this issue, and they tell me they don't know. They're asking me, and I say, I don't know. I mean, you should be going out and finding out exactly what is being given and how it's being given. I think that we've seen in the last couple of years, while the Chinese have definitely learned lessons, and Chinese are brilliant at this, and I love the Chinese in terms of economic partners and in being able to spend their money smartly, their investment wisely. They have a couple of different trends right now. One of them is the provincial money. It's no longer centrally controlled. The second thing is that as the lines of communication open up, whether it's the bridge across, the Yalu and the trains into Raison, you've got potential just much more trade going on, local trade. And certainly the trucks rolling into Pyongyang, it's not clear what's rolling off these to a lot of people. So I think we don't know how much of it is, in kind and how much of it may be hard cash. I think that if I were in Chinese strategic circles, I would want to be influencing friends in high places. And that's not just building a bridge. So I can't prove that, but I'm just thinking out loud. It's logical. Now let me just look at the South Korean portion of this. You're absolutely right. There's a fundamental economic irony here that the South Korea capitalist country is using, unfortunately, propping up an autocratic regime by the method of payment, most of which the lion's share goes to the regime to use willy-nilly, and we know how they use it. And only a little of it goes to the workers, although the workers are still middle class by North Korean standards. They're still not getting much of the fruits of their labor. That's why Choco Pie became a de facto currency. It was a way, literally, the South Koreans wanted them to be bartering this for bribes and for money and access, and that's why North Korea actually had to consider clamping down on that as an illegal currency. It's hard to believe. I think your scheme is a good one if you can end up eventually negotiating it, but you're going to have to re-engage to even get there. There are two other things that the South Korea has been trying to seek with Kaesong, at least. One of them is just the infrastructure. Again, go back to power. They need electricity and water. They need roads, railroad. That infrastructure is not just for the benefit of Pyongyang. That is ultimately to the benefit of access that will come about. This expressway will one day be built. I mean, I'm sure of it. Goodness knows when it'll be, but there'll be something there. The second thing is that it's ideas. It's the power of something as simple as cosmetics. I mean, it's that simple. It's how was the Cold War won? It was won with ideas. So this is the Trojan horse, theory. And that's why North Korea also not only xenophobic, but also very knowledgeable about what everybody might be trying to do, namely threaten their survival, wants to keep a lid and tries to contain these special economic zones and contain everything that goes on. And so the new headquarters at Kaesong, you can look out and see the Korean Workers' Army at some distance, protecting the Kaesong Industrial Complex from attack. But you are in a very isolated place that doesn't have access to the internet. The best you have is you've got bus access now that's just been extended out to 40 kilometers, I think, from Kaesong. But that starts to open up still windows of knowledge. And that's starting, in a society where you've got 1 million cell phones that can at least call other North Koreans. I don't know, that's having an impact. You can't have the ability to close down your ideas about the outside world the way you could 10 years ago. And it's partly because of Kaesong. So that doesn't undermine anything you said. I just would add that as other elements to think about as well.
Good, thanks. Mark?
Thanks. Mark Mannion with the Congressional Research Service. Excuse me. Patrick, thank you. I really look forward to reading this report. I love the way you sort of use Kaesong as sort of a metaphor to, as a portal to get into these bigger issues. And you've made everyone's job harder because now we have to read this to incorporate into our ideas.
You're acknowledged in the first page.
Thank you. Sort of connecting the last two questions, one of, the e-government has put up some, like as you said, they haven't shut down Kaesong, even though there was pressure to do so. But they've also imposed some conditionality on things that they would like, as you hinted at, to expand Kaesong beyond its current sort of very incremental, sort of almost inertia, expansion, but to really go beyond that, to build the dormitories that would be necessary to go beyond that, other infrastructure projects. How much do you think that conditionality should continue? In other words, if Kaesong is going to be a Trojan horse, it would seem that you'd need to negotiate some new provisions on communication, on internet, other things. Should the next government insist on that, or should they sort of adopt, once again, a long-term view and say, look, we're just going to go ahead and plunge into this, expand, and hope that down the road these spillovers are going to happen? And then likewise for the U.S. Side, of course, while we haven't been trying to stop Kaesong, which we have tools that we could have tried to impede it, we also haven't been trying to promote it. Presumably, if a left-of-center government comes into power in Seoul, they're going to want to revisit and push the whole Kaesong into chorus issues. That's something that we should seriously consider, or should we also have some conditions on what we want to see at Kaesong?
Well, Mark, those are great points, and I look forward to reading your report, looking at those options in the future, because seriously, those are fraught with lots of peril because of the difficulty of negotiating with North Korea is not to be underestimated. Ambassador Pritchard here, has worn out a lot of airplanes and trains probably to New York trying to negotiate things. And I don't want to anticipate how difficult it will be even for a government that is seen in a better light in Pyongyang. And what is a better light in Pyongyang? A better light may be a better deal from their perspective, not necessarily a more serious negotiating partner. So if we look ahead to 2013, and we're speculating now, will that collective leadership be more or less the same as Kim Jong-il's regime, or will it be starting to really change? Will it be fracturing? Will there be other things going on? Who knows at this point, even while imminent collapse doesn't seem to be possible, or likely rather, everything is possible. I think if we start to engage more individuals in that collective leadership, maybe U.S. ROK together, even with a new government in the Blue House in particular, if not here in the White House, can put together a roadmap of engagement that would allow the rewriting of those rules. Those rules are archaic. They do need to change. And the fact that North Korea has made far more liberal arrangements for the Chinese suggests that they could be persuaded to open, in principle at least, could be more open to change, just on the face of it. But they're not going to do it with President Lee Myung-bak. I love the man, but they're not going to do it with him. They're just not going to. It's my judgment. I may be wrong, but everything I've seen suggests that they're just not going to do this. If a more liberal government comes in, offering essentially a sunshine by another name policy, 2.0, 3.0, if we can work out between Seoul and Washington the terms of reference on how to use smart power and do that wisely, so we're not also just throwing money away trying to befriend the North to please, please, please do something, because desperation doesn't make a very good negotiating policy either, then hopefully you could say, look, we really want more infrastructure, we really want more jobs, we really want to boost your economy, but this is what we're going to do. And obviously it presupposes a certain, at least, freeze of any kind of lethal use of force, further nuclear. That's sort of a given, even while what we have to probably desist in is insisting that we make the verifiable end of the nuclear program anytime soon. That's just not going to get there soon. So we're going to have to figure out a way to not let down our interest in that, but be more realistic about how long it may take us to get there. And it's possible at this point. This year, though, I think the main thing is to build engagement channels and find out individuals we can get access to, start working with them, expand, use the food deal, use the little work at Kaesong, use the talks going on the nuclear issue, use the MIA issue, and start to expand other programs through civil society and government alike so that we can expand channels of communication in North Korea right now while we reconsider how to get leverage and a longer-term plan, basically. Trying to achieve the same thing but over a longer period of time in 2013.
Let me follow, and I'll get right here, to follow up with that last comment in terms of a realistic approach with regard to the nuclear issue. It's been reported in today's news that former senior director Jeff Bader had indicated that the administration's policy really is freeze and degrade rather than a wholehearted effort to denuclearize. Is that closer to what you're thinking about they ought to be doing?
And I've talked to Jeff Bader about this, and he's, I don't want to characterize his views on this, but certainly a freeze is a good idea. One of the challenges there, of course, how can you verify a freeze? Right now, the North Koreans very cleverly have invited us to buy back Yongbyon for a third time. This time, the new attraction at this theme park is that it's got an advanced enriched uranium facility that Dr. Hecker saw in November 2010. So it's worth buying, if you will. But why would we believe that's the only nuclear site to be of concern? And the problem when you don't have real access to the country is you don't know. And so you don't know what you're buying. And that's a legitimate, serious national security concern for South Korea, the United States, Japan, others in the region. But freezing and degrading while you're engaging a young regime, I'm struck by the age of Kim Jong-un. Last night I had dinner and I found out that the youngest ever National Security Council senior director at the White House is currently employed. He's 26 years old, and he's our guru for cyber, which in that cyber, younger, the smarter probably. But when you have nuclear weapons at your disposal and you have people outside ranting about mad dogs, it's probably not a great thing to have a 29-year-old, even nominally, in charge of that regime, because how do you know what's happening? So I think freezing, degrading, engaging is part of that. I want to see a military-to-military engagement if we can get in. I want to get access to the collective leaders. I don't want Chong Sung-taek and others just to be in the pocket of the Chinese. He's one of the guys, I think, who's got those nice wads of money in his pockets from opening up some of these Chinese investments. We need to start thinking about how we get access to these individuals and changing the conversation.
Okay, good. John, do you still have a question?
Yes.
Okay.
I'm John Brinkley. I work for the Embassy of Korea here in Washington.
Great embassy.
Thank you. In the context of the Chorus FTA, or I should say in the debate over it, there was a lot of concern expressed about the possibility that products made at Kaesong might be exported to the United States. And we went to great lengths to say that that was highly unlikely and that there was nothing in Chorus that would facilitate that. But my question is, Chorus aside, would exports from Kaesong to the United States be such an objectionable thing in your view?
It's a good question. You're right. It was a contentious part, even if it wasn't widely appreciated in the public during the free trade agreement with Korea debate in Capitol Hill. And a lot of those concerns were essentially allayed by the idea that there would not be goods flowing from Kaesong to the U.S. open market as part of course. Most of the goods that are sold outside of South Korea head to other markets. So there's not a need. I know the one good I have that was made in Kaesong Industrial Complex that I was given by the head of the Kaesong Industrial Complex probably would cost a lot of money if I tried to buy it here in the United States. Since I don't work for the government, I was able to accept this. But it was more of a novelty. It's not something I use. It's a clock. It's a very sophisticated clock. Probably has GPS in it as well, I don't know. But it's a, I think seriously, that, the Democratic United Party in particular would probably like to renegotiate the terms of reference, of course, including, that is true. We know that is true, in fact. So I'll state it as a fact, not as a possibility. And that they would love to see those goods from Kaesong be treated like South Korean goods. Would that be a bad thing for the United States? Not if the United States and South Korea agreed on a plan for how to now move ahead comprehensively with North Korea. If it were part of a package deal in our alliance, it's not a bad deal. Now, I can't sell that to Congress. I can't sell anything to Congress in this election year. Good luck, this is an election year, so none of this is popular. So I apologize that I'm talking to cameras that now can be run in the election. It is so difficult to try to have a sensible long-term discussion about North Korea policy, but we need to have a bipartisan approach in the United States. We need a bipartisan approach in South Korea. And so as part of that bipartisan strategy sold to Washington, that's possible in my mind. But it does have to fit in with the other pieces. I wouldn't do it now, but I think it should be put on the table. It will be put on the table by perhaps the next government of South Korea. So we're going to have to grapple with it as a government, and rather than just reject it out of hand, we ought to think, how does this fit into our comprehensive engagement and containment and freeze and degrade policy with North Korea?
Okay. Yes.
Edgar Gordon. I think you mentioned earlier on, talking about the long-term issue of reunification, that it depended a good deal on a reduction in the distance between the South Korean and the North Korean economy, so that, in fact, you don't have quite as bad a problem as you had between the two parts of Germany. It seems to me, though, that the issue there, then, is North Korean domestic economic policy. Not whether you have Kaesong or you have Nampo or one of these other things, because as you sent out, these could simply be exchange-earning enclaves, which simply strengthen the existing North Korean government rather than changing anything fundamental. I mean, as we know, as recently as 2009, you had a currency reform, which was obviously aimed at destroying what little private enterprise there was in North Korea, but was finally ended and so on. And as you probably also know, the Chinese over the years have tried to persuade North Korea to follow a sort of a Chinese-style communist policy rather than the one that they have as well. So I don't see how Kaesong or any of these other things really have much impact over the long run in terms of the fundamental relationship between North Korea and South Korea. There's another issue, for example, Japan. The North Koreans have been very nasty to the Japanese. On the other hand, the Japanese have said that they're prepared to pay reparations, just in the way they paid reparations to South Korea. Opening up North Korea to real foreign investment, not only Chinese, but also Japanese, South Korean, and so on, would make an enormous difference in the economic prospects of that country. And as far as Chinese investment is concerned, I mean, I would think it's all to the good, because at least it helps a bit in raising the level of North Korean productivity and growth slightly, even, whether or not it leads to more influence of China. But I mean, China's bound to have a great deal of influence in North Korea, given the situation.
Well, thank you for those comments. I mean, I agree that obviously Kaesong Industrial Complex, as it is run now, will not transform North Korea. But is it a model for opening up engagement in general that could lead to different deals being struck, different engagements, of which the infrastructure could be just the physical manifestation of a political agreement, which is not here yet and isn't in prospect. But the question is, could we develop that? Could it be developed over the next years? And that's sort of what I'm asking through this report, not answering. I think the idea of third party, if you will, not Chinese or South Korean, but third party investment, other international investment, is on the table. I do write about it very briefly in my study, but since I was writing a relatively brief monograph, I wanted to contrast the Chinese-South Korean investment going in different directions. Of course, for the reasons that you hinted at, namely the North Koreans really loathe the Japanese, and the North Korean government and country came about fighting the Japanese, it's a very hard sell, I suspect, in North Korea to accept that in either Pyongyang or in Tokyo. And I work very closely with the Japanese government, and the Japanese are still fixated on the abductee issue. It's a very sensitive, understandably, you have citizens abducted, but it's a very difficult obstacle for creative policy. There'd have to be some other, we're presupposing some other political breakthrough, if you will, with this Kim Jong-un regime. And the real question is, how do we even explore or probe the possibility that might be possible that they could open up to South Korea, Japan, or others beyond China, beyond Russia? And that's where we need to widen the discussions, not necessarily give away gifts, but we need to widen the discussions to the extent possible and just think about what is possible, who might be making these decisions. I don't discount Japanese investment. I just think that Japanese won't be leading the charge of the international investment. They're going to have cover to move on this issue, both from South Korea, the United States, and even domestically in Japan.
Gil?
Well, Professor Rothman, I'm sure I have not done justice to the Chinese strategy, and it's difficult to know which Chinese strategy we might be talking about. I'm suggesting there's maybe been an evolution in some of the Chinese thinking in the last few years as they've been increasingly concerned about instability on their border. And in the last couple of years, there's been increasing interest in actually investing in North Korea in a way that they weren't interested in earlier attempts. We do need to try to create a common policy with China. And I think Jeff Bader, among other senior officials who've worked in this administration alone, not to mention previous administrations, would say the U.S. government has tried very hard to reach that common understanding. And we're very frustrated by the lack of the ability to get a common understanding. Hence my discussion of Dai Bingguo being sort of the exception to that, finally, when it was sort of too little too late, but nonetheless still an important intervention coming in to at least tamp down North Korea's fervor and contain them. Not working off the same strategy, but at least working in parallel on the same objective of stability. And right now, with Kim Jong-un, I would suggest we have a temporary common goal. We all should want stability right now with an unknown collective leadership, more than before. So the United States should put a higher value on stability in 2012 than we did before Kim Jong-il died, I would argue. There are some who disagree with that. They think, no, this is an opportunity. Push them to the ground. That's a minority argument, I would argue, but I think that's too risky. So let's seize that opportunity with China to see if we can get more cooperation. But I think China may be interested in a long-term buffer state, that historic case, more now when they look at the rebalancing of American power to Asia, when they look at American inroads in Burma, when they look at the South China Sea contests. It's entirely possible that those even relatively short-term events, recent events, which are part of a long continuum, really, of who knows where this will go. But I think since the end of the Cold War, the United States has been bipartisan support for essentially a growing prioritization of the rising Asia-Pacific region. It's sort of a no-brainer in many ways. But this administration has put even a bigger focus on this so-called pivot, this rebalancing, not that it's a short-term thing, but that they are, even in the short term, heading more in that direction. And China may be saying, you know what, you can stay in the Pacific, but the extent you infringe on our interests, that's not really welcome. And in that process of working out with Chinese changing leadership coming to power, and Xi Jinping's obviously laid down a good foundation for beginning a dialogue, and our government, or if it's a changed government next year, will have to try to sit down and reach a common framework, and so will South Korea. So I don't know how we get leverage without China. We could say the same thing with a lot of other issues in the world. I mean, Iran policy right now, how do you get leverage without Russia and China? Well, you're limited to some degree, to maybe some significant degree. In the case of North Korea, there's a huge limit, because I think North Korea, by proximity, China by proximity and by essentially liquid assets and engineers and infrastructure and desire for resources and desire for stability, is now strategically deepening that investment. They have a logical interest in it, not just for the warm water port, which is Russia's main interest. They have a deep and abiding, growing interest, I would argue. And that trend I can't see abating unless China is so otherwise engaged with other problems that they can't be bothered. That doesn't necessarily answer your question, but those are some of my thoughts.
Chad in the back, please.
Thanks. Chad O'Carroll at KEI. I'm not sure if you saw Andrei Lankov's piece yesterday, which was about let North Korea keep its nukes is the title. He's basically suggesting that you take away the bargaining chip and you'll make more progress. I'm just wondering, from your perspective, do you think that would facilitate the type of engagement you're talking from a South Korean perspective and allow them to increase influence through places like Kaesong? Thanks.
Yes. I'm not the first speaker to be not able to read as fast as Andre can write, so I didn't see that piece. But the thrust of what you just presented sounds logical to me. Not that we could run out and sell a bipartisan policy of forget about the nukes, because we can't forget about the nukes. I mean, the nukes are a real security threat, so I don't want to trivialize them. But lower the priority of the timeline in which you think you're going to get to the nuclear issue and put other things on the table. So essentially, if you can't solve a problem, enlarge the problem. And I think he's right in that sense. Now, it sounds like he's making a very specific argument, saying we keep trying to use that as the bargaining chip. We'll put more pressure and everything on the table for that nuclear program, and the price just keeps going up, but the goal is no closer in reach. If we take it away and say, no, that's not what we're reaching for. We're actually reaching for this contact and this investment and this, I think, yes, that is the way to go, especially with this transition in the regime. That is, yes, on the surface, no different from before, but under the surface, who knows? New people, new dynamics, and therefore potential new policy.
Any other questions? This has been a terrific discussion. Patrick, let me thank you for the research, the effort, the terrific writing. I recommend to all of you to actually read this. If you want to encourage your friends to visit both of our websites in the very near future, you'll be able to see this program in video form. So if you would, please join me in thanking
Jack,
Dr. Cronin. Oh, yes,
I just want to thank everybody for coming. Great questions and comments. And I'd also be remiss if I didn't thank Zachary Hosford and Daniel Katz at the Center for New American Security, who were just instrumental in everything we do on Asia. Thank you.
Good. You're quite welcome.